Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. My name is William. Welcome to Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. Today we are back in the TBM. We're going to be flying a VOR DME approach. We're flying into Jackson Hole, so we're using the VOR DME runway 19 approach. I'll have the approach plate up here on for the video, as well as in a link in the description below if you want to follow along that way. At the moment, we are proceeding direct to the Delta November Whiskey VOR. We're going to fly outbound on that VOR on the 267 radial for 10.5 miles. That will intercept Nesset. I do have it loaded in the GPS, but we're going to try and fly this off of Green Needles. So 10.5 on that 267 radial. That will be Nesset. Also 16.1 on the Jackson VOR, which is in Nav 1. You can see Jackson and DNW already set up in the frequencies. Before we get there, we're going to intercept the 193 course inbound into the Jackson VOR, which is on 115.4. Our approach course is 193. The runway we'll be landing on is runway 19 at Jackson, 6,300 feet, touchdown zone elevation and airport elevation 6451. In between DNW and Nesset, we're going to go down to 11,400. And our minimums today are 7,840 feet, 1 1/4 mile visibility. So we're just about 12 miles out of DNW right now. I do want to go ahead and come right just a little bit. I want to figure out what will get me directly there, but I also want to go ahead and set up my course to 267 basically, so I'm ready to fly outbound. See, it looks like this heading will take us right to DNW. And we'll go ahead and set 11,400 in the speed bug. Now then, before we get to DNW, I would like to go ahead and set up my speed bug for my approach speed, 85 knots. It's going to be very important to get on top of our speed and get the aircraft slowed down, especially on a VOR approach. And I also want to set up my minimums. So minimums to Barrow and 7840 is what we're flying to. 7840 or it looks like 1,400 feet on the radio altimeter, radar altimeter, whichever one it is. So right now we're actually basically inbound on the radial we want to leave on, so this could be really good for us. Since we're on this heading and we're lined up so well with DNW, we're going to go ahead and switch over to VOR 1, and now let's set this to our course. So we're going to go to course 1 because it's Nav 1, and we're going to set this to 193, so I don't have to set this up later when we're kind of fumbling around. These VOR approaches can get very hectic very fast, so want to stay on top of it. We're 5 miles from Delta November Whiskey, and at that point, like I said, we're going to descend to 11,400 and we're going to fly it basically until about 7 miles out, and I'm going to switch over to VOR or Nav 1 and start to intercept our approach course into Jackson. Once we are kind of around Nesset, we can go down to 9,400, and then our next point will be 9 DME from Jacksonville. That's Lagic. We can descend to 8,500, and then 5.6 DME from Jackson. We can descend all the way down to our minimums of 7840 and fly that until we spot the runway. So we're outbound now. We need to come right just a little bit. We're not outbound yet. It is just getting really sensitive. It's very easy to get a little bit ahead of yourself. So we're 1 mile from Delta November Whiskey. Yeah, there it is. It's kind of transitioning. It's going to be extremely sensitive to adjustment here as we pass over it, and it'll kind of dull out, so don't want to go too crazy. But since we are outbound, let's go down to 11,400. Alright, so let's come right just a little bit. And let's start pulling the power back. The reason I want to get a decent approach speed early on in this one is just because it is a VOR approach. We could literally pop out by the runway 1,400 feet basically over the ground. if you're going too fast at that point, you're not saving it really. So want to get established on 85 knots, full flaps, gear down, all that, basically around car seat, and fly that in. So we're 4 miles out from D&W at the moment. We're pretty well established here on the 267 outbound radial. Go ahead and see what the wind looks like real quick. I should have set this up earlier. Other PFD settings, wind, option 3. Go back to the main. Yeah, we're getting blown to the wind's coming from the south a little bit, so it's kind of affecting us. We're coming up on 7 miles. 7 miles from Delta November Whiskey. I'm going to go ahead and switch over. But we are on the radial. Like I said, it'd be 16.1 and 10.5 from Delta November Whiskey. So we'll go ahead and switch over to VOR 1, and we'll kind of watch this come in. As it starts to move towards us, we're getting closer to lining it up. 8.5 and 16.8, so you can see it is definitely getting closer. We're flying directly towards Nesset. Let's go ahead and activate our approach mode, and it is going to capture this for us. We can set our nav bug now down to 9,400, and let's start our descent down. So we've got a decent amount of time here. Meppel is 12 DME. We're 14 miles from that at the moment. And Lagic is 9 DME, so even further out from Lagic before we have to, or before we can descend any further than 9,400. So I should have turned my inertial separator on earlier, and also let's go ahead and get our landing lights on. So we're coming through 10,000 feet. Get ourselves slowed down. So we are inbound now, 193 to Jackson Hole, down to 9,400, and we're basically going to hold 9,400 all the way until 9 DME, which is Lagic. So I'll kind of zoom this in so you can see a little bit easier. Lagic here is 9 from the Jackson VOR. 9 nautical miles from the Jackson VOR, but we're not using the GPS here. It's just there kind of as a visual aid. We're flying it all off of these green needles here at the moment. Alright, so we are 0.6 of a mile from Meppel. We are at 9,400. Holding about 154 knots. Can't see a thing out the windscreen. Descending down still to 9,400, 400 feet from it. Let's go ahead and pull the power back a little bit more. We're below 178 knots, so flaps 1 we can do. We can get our gear out as well. Not sure what that was about. I think it's that I bumped the trim on my throttle. Very unsettling. Alright, gear is down. .8, so we're almost to Lagic. Let's go ahead and set our altitude bug to 8,500. At 9 miles, we'll bump it all the way down to 8,500. And let's start slowing down even more. There's just past 9 miles. Let's go down to 8,500. Next altitude change will be 5.6 miles from Jackson, and that will be all the way down to our minimums, 7,840 feet. Try to get the runway in sight. So now we're both flying out the windows and on the instruments. We're 7 miles from Jackson. We're starting to see some ground beneath us, but the visibility is not the best. 1 mile now from Carsey. There's 8,500. We'll go ahead and set 90 or 7,900 in the altitude. There, we're below 122 knots. We can go full flaps and get set on 85 knots for our approach speed. 6 miles from Jackson, 0.4 to go before we drop down to minimums. We're on 85 knots. There's 5.6. Let's just go all the way down to 7,900. Pull the power back. So we do have the ground in sight. So it's just going to be a matter of getting a little bit closer here, I think, to see Jackson. Or Jackson Hole. You can see our minimums is still going to be 1,400 feet over the ground. So if we had to get, you know, right over the top of the runway, and we can actually see it there, you could just see the runway off in front of us. And that is right around our minimums, so we can go ahead and disengage the autopilot and start setting ourselves up for the approach here. Let's get back on power. I'd rather be over my approach speed than by a little bit than that far under it. It's not great. So the VOR approach, yeah, it doesn't let you get that low at all. And you know, you can fly that all the way in to very, very close to the runway and you know, pop out. That's kind of what I was saying, is popping out at 1,400 feet over the runway and not being on speed. It can get out of hand very quickly. We need to hold this altitude. I keep descending, and we're well below glide path. So let's hold the altitude. Let's hold 85 and try and hold around 72 knots. 72 knots. 85 knots and 7,200 feet until we kind of get on glide path here. Lining ourselves up. Like I said, I'd rather be 2-3 knots fast than we were at about 80. Airspeed is very, very nice to have in the airplane in case something starts going wrong. Alright, so now we're a little bit high. That's just fine. We start backing off the power. We're lined up with the runway. We're a full 800 feet below our minimums now, and it still isn't even anywhere near as close as you could get on a ILS approach or even a GPS approach. VOR approaches happen very fast, and they're quite a lot to manage, in all honesty. But if it's your option, it's what you use. It's really all you got. I'd always pick a GPS approach or an ILS approach over a VOR approach. But for practice, I think they're pretty darn good. Alright, start pulling the power back. Let's get on speed a little bit better. Pull the power out. Start to flare. Pretty close to center line. Not a terrible landing. Not the best landing in the world, but not a terrible one. First time trying it from that view. That was a little bit awkward. But yeah, that's a VOR DME approach into Jackson Hole. It's really one of those that I think you really have to stay on top of it. Even that, I felt super rusty, and I'm sure it wasn't perfect. And it's something that you need to brief well and understand the approach before you fly it, because it can get quite hectic and happen very, very fast. You know, you could always use the GPS there that you've got, but the majority of the time, in all honesty, most airplanes I ever flew, they didn't necessarily have that option, and if they did, it was kind of looked down upon to practice it that way, just because you never know, you might have to do it the old-fashioned way. It's more fun to practice it that way. It's not necessarily going to be more fun to do it in real life that way. But good practice in the sim. I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching. If you did like it, like the video, subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this, more flying in general, whatever. Thanks so much for hanging out today, and I'll catch you on the next one. Bye-bye.